Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we'll explore two fundamental access control models, the discretionary access control and the mandatory access control. These are essential concepts for anyone managing system security or designing secure application. So let's start with the discretionary access control model or a DAC. So in this one, the owner of a resource. Now, what is a resource? A resource is sort of like an object. It can be a file, it is a folder, it can be a system. So this is something on which a worker or a subject is going to perform some action. So for example, a subject may be a person and file may be the object or the resource. So in this one, owner of a resource determines who can access it and how they can access it. Let me give you a very simple example. Take the example of a Google Docs file that you have created. Since you are the owner, you get to decide who you want to give access or permission to. You can add specific people. Moreover, you can also decide exactly what permissions someone will have. For example, you may give person A read-only access while giving person B read and write access. So it's a pretty simple model. The owner of a resource basically decides who can access and how they can access it. Moreover, granting or revoking access is at the discretion of the owner. And that's why it's called a discretionary access control or DAC, because it is entirely up to the discretion of the owner to grant access, grant a particular type of access, or revoke access. Now, with the discretionary access model, there are two key things that you need to understand. The first is that it is ownership based. So obviously the owner gets to decide who gets access and how they can get access to a resource. But it also involves delegation. So the owner can delegate access. So for example, if you have a file and you are the owner, you can also delegate the same access to another person. A very simple example of discretionary access control is operating systems. So let's say you are working on a Linux operating system and there is a file and you are the owner of that file. Now it is entirely up to you. You can grant access to other users, other group of users, or revoke their access. For example, you can assign read-only access, you can assign execution-only access, or read and write access, anything that you want. Now the primary advantage of discretionary access model is that it's very simple and flexible. It is very easy for an individual user to manage their own file or resources and decide who they want to share with. However, there are some disadvantages as well. So the first one is what we call as a Trojan horse problem. So the basic idea is that let's say person A has access to a resource or a file and they delegate this access to person B. Now that person B may inadvertently execute actions which are unauthorized because they may have been compromised. But since person A gave all the access to, or they delegated the access to person B, now anything that person B executes will also impact person A. So for example, this person is delegating access to this person. However, this person has a Trojan installed. Now since this person will have access to the resource that the first person provided, therefore anything that this person executes, including the Trojan or the malware, is also going to impact the first person. And the reason this happens is because it's super simple and the access can be complete. So for example, this person can give exactly the same access to this person, which works fine if it's a personal system, but it's not a great strategy if you want to use it in an enterprise. The next disadvantage is that there is less centralized control. So this means that you cannot have a central authority, for example, in larger environments such as corporate environments, which is making the decisions. So the owner could be different people within the organization, and then it's very hard to scale it. So for example, for every person and all the resources that they own, they have to specify that, okay, this person can do this person can do this. So it's very hard to scale. Now, the complete opposite of discretionary access control is what we call as mandatory access control. So in Mac, access decisions are not at the discretion of the resource owner. So even if you are the owner of a file or a resource or, for example, a web server, you don't get to decide. Instead, they're based on a system-wide security policy enforced by a central authority. So for example, think of it like in an organization, different people may be owners of different things. For example, A data scientist may be the owner of some certain data that they generate. A manager could be owner of certain, for example, classified documents, but they don't get to decide that who can access what. It's the centralized authority or a system administrator, or in terms of computers, it can be the security kernel. So within, for example, your operating system, you have this special element called security kernel. So in terms of systems, this centralized authority is going to make the decisions. And if you want to understand mandatory access control, this is the key point to understand. So both subjects, so what are subjects? People or processes that are performing the actions. And what are objects? The files or the data on which the actions are performed. So both of these are assigned clearance levels or labels. So everything in a mandatory access control has a certain clearance level or label. Let me explain this in a bit more detail. So the first thing you need to understand with mandatory access control is that it's a completely centralized solution. There is a central authority which decides who gets access and what type of access. Secondly, we have something which we call clearance levels or labels. And let me tell you something very interesting. The mandatory access control is widely used by intelligence agencies or government. Now, you need to understand that there are two broad categories. The first category are unclassified documents. So these are not necessarily classified and they do not require special protection or vetting of personnel or people accessing these documents or this information. Then above this, there are three levels which are called classified documents, which basically means that they need to be protected in some way. So the first of that classified level is called confidential. So confidential documents are those whose unauthorized release could cause national security issues. These could be related to government secrets or military secrets or those kind of things. However, depending on context, this can be something different as well. So for example, for certain organizations, it could be organizational charts, rosters, those kind of things. Above confidential is the next level of classified information, which is called secret information. Now, secret information or secret documents is serious information that could cause significant damage to national security or that organization. And this would require individuals with higher security clearance levels to access this information. And finally, at the top, we have top secret. This is the highest level of classification. Disclosure of top secret information could cause exceptional damage to national security or that organization. Now, let's say there is a person who has a confidential level clearance, then he can read documents that are unclassified as well as read documents that are confidential. Okay, so documents would be the objects and that person would be the subject. If someone has secret level clearance, then they can read unclassified documents, confidential documents, as well as secret documents. And finally, people with top security clearance would be able to read all of these documents. So just understand, you have the subjects, which can be, for example, people, and then you have the objects, which are basically resources. And everything is classified. So people have security clearance levels and resources or objects also have security clearance levels. And the person has to have at least the same level or a higher security clearance level in order to read that document. And this is how mandatory access control works. One of the most well-known models that exemplifies mandatory access controls or MAC is the Bell-LaPadula model, and it's very widely used in the intelligence community. It has two basic principles. No read up, which basically means that a person or a subject at a lower clearance level cannot read documents at a higher clearance level. So for example, someone with confidential level clearance won't be able to read secret level documents or top secret level documents. Someone with secret level clearance won't be able to read top secret level documents. That is the basic idea. So no read up. Someone sitting here cannot read this. Someone sitting here cannot read documents which are here. Okay, this is called no read up. So you cannot read up. The second principle is no write down, which basically means that if someone has top secret level clearance, they can only create or write documents at this level. They're not allowed to write documents at a lower level. Why do you think is this? I mean, this person has top secret clearance, right? He should be able to create documents or resources which are secret or which are confidential, right? What do you think could be the reason? Well, the reason is this: someone who has this level of clearance, he may have access or information about something which is top secret. And if they create documents at a lower level, they may inadvertently leak some top secrets which would be accessible to people who are sitting at these levels. That's the basic idea. Okay? So, to sum it up, mandatory access control is all about creating security clearance levels or labels, and then assigning subjects those labels as well as objects. And then both have to match, or the subject clearance level has to be above in order to read, and there is no read up as well as no write down. Now, mandatory access control has some strengths as well. It is highly secure. It is exceptionally resistant to insider threats because access is not left up to individual discretion but is strictly controlled by system wide policies. And the downside are that it's very complex. The reason being, imagine if you have 1000 subjects or 1000 people and you have 10,000 resources, then you need to assign classification or labels to every subject and every object. So it's extremely complex. And that's also one of the reasons why it's very rigid. So it won't work well in environments in which you need flexibility. Now, the basic idea behind mandatory access controls is sort of like a military like or intelligence like management. So that's why security is the top priority and complexity, flexibility are not really the strong points. Now, let's have a quick comparison of discretionary access control and mandatory access control, which would be sort of a revision of whatever we've covered and also sort of like an overview. So, in terms of flexibility, discretionary access control is very highly flexible because the owner has complete discretion to assign whatever permissions to whoever he wants. In comparison, mandatory access control is very rigid. It's not flexible at all because a centralized authority is making the decisions. There is no decentralization or discussion or those kind of things. In terms of complexity, this is really straightforward, right? The owner decides, okay, this guy will have this permission and this person is going to have this permission and so on. But mandatory access control complexity is very high because every subject and object need to be classified or assigned a label and so on and so forth. In terms of security, the security of this model is really low because, as we discussed, you can have the Trojan horse problem, right? So, for example, imagine that you are the root user on a Linux system. And if you assign the same permissions to another user, for example, execute read write permissions to a file or a resource, and that user may inadvertently execute malicious code, not necessarily, with malicious intent, but they may be compromised. And then they'll have sort of like the same access or same powers as you, and it can cause serious damage. In mandatory access control, security is really high. It's strict policy enforcement because, as we discussed, there is no read up or write down. In terms of application, discretionary access control are typically used in personal systems, whereas mandatory access controls are typically used in government and military.